It's a place where you can get away from it all. Despite all of the darkness, it's a place that we call home.
Hello everyone, my name is Katy Walker and I'm a licensed clinical social worker at the University of Kentucky. I work at the Barnstable Brown Diabetes Center. Today we are going to be reviewing a short PowerPoint and discussing type 1 diabetes, rebellion, and your teenager. As I'm sure many of you know from either raising your own kids, remembering your own teenage years, or being in the thick of it right now, teen rebellion is not something new, and it is absolutely not only connected to type 1 diabetes. It happens for a vast majority of teens, and hopefully, even though it is very stressful, there are ways that you can manage it so that way it doesn't hinder your relationship with your teen or lead them to, potentially doing dangerous behaviors. So as we've discussed, teen rebellion is absolutely not just, for those with type 1, but it does often cause kids who do have type 1, especially if they've had it for, an extended period of time. They kind of go away from being the model patient. A lot of parents tell me that, when their child is 7, 8, 9, they're so good about telling them when they've eaten. They're so good about taking their insulin. They're so good about letting their parents count their carbs. And we really see kids in their adolescent and teen years start to move away from that behavior. So let's look at why that happens. Okay, so why does this happen? Biology plays a huge part in that. So first, let's look at, there are a few different theories of things that happen. Personally, I think it's not just ever one of these things. It's oftentimes all three, in my opinion, combined. So first, we have burnout. That is something your child and you are probably going to experience over and over again over the life of this disease. I do think it becomes especially more prevalent during the teenage years, because I think this is a period of time where children are already kind of, trying to distance themselves from parents, so that burnout is even more prevalent. Speaking of which, that natural phenomenon of your teen wanting that independence from you, this is so important for their development. It happens with every kid. In this instance, though, it might lead to less diabetes management. So we can see that, there might not, any parental oversight will be perceived as nagging by your teen. Just look at when you ask them to clean their room, do their homework. Are you, do you think those friends are a good influence? Anything you say to them, oftentimes, if it's a corrective behavior or you're wanting them to correct something, they will perceive that as nagging. So that is definitely a part of it. Another thing is, that idea of, oh, Mom, you don't understand, which could just be a teen's anthem a lot of the time. And in reality, unless you yourself do have type 1, I mean, there probably is that disconnect of them feeling like, how can they really put themselves in my shoes? And then finally, just the natural teen disposition of wanting to distance themselves from their parents. So, friends become such a bigger priority oftentimes than family members for a teenager. And then with that, move away or like focus on friendships, I guess, there are some other natural things that sort of fall away. For example, high schoolers will often do their own carb counting and own treatment. So that natural observation, that natural oversight that came with a school nurse being in charge of them, that's gone. And them being away from the home for more activities and focus more on friends, that oversight, from the parental side of things, that's also decreased. Speaking of biology that I mentioned earlier, biology is absolutely a part of it, but some of the things I was discussing was more related to social development. Well, if we actually look at the anatomy of the brain, the part that helps someone manage their emotional response, judgment or problem-solving skills, and also their ability to maintain attention, that part is the prefrontal cortex. And that doesn't actually stop developing until a person is 25 years old, which also explains some of the thinking processes and also some of the impulses that we often see in our teenage population. So some signs of rebellion First of all, your child that has type 1, the usual signs will also apply. Being a little bit sassy, being a little bit defiant, not really complying with household rules quite as closely as they used to. But some of those more specific to type 1 that we often see in really kids of any age, but maybe specifically in this period, would be things like not checking their blood glucose like they are prescribed to do. And I know technology has gotten a lot more advanced just in the last, 5, 6 years. So that would also include things like trying to block access to Dexcom, changing alerts on on their Dexcom. Something else maybe to look for would be a notable increase in A1C. That doesn't seem to really make sense with how you thought diabetes was being managed. And this last one, we're going to go back more to this later in the presentation, but rapid weight loss is also something to look out for. Okay, so we looked at some signs of rebellion. Right now, we're going to look at specific types of concerning behaviors. And I chose these just based on what seems to come up the most frequently in our clinic here at Barnstable Brown, and what I tend to kind of talk to parents and their teens about. So first is substance abuse, and that includes alcohol and drugs. First, I hope this conversation is an ongoing thing for you and your teen. As soon as they start getting into adolescence, make it age appropriate. Don't dump on them all at once, but just sort of a slow education and an openness about it, so hopefully they can come to you. That being said, we do have to make sure we underline to them the differences of how their body will react under alcohol, for example, and how a body without type 1 might react. And that would be the risk of significant hypoglycemia, because our liver would be working to detox the alcohol, and that glucagon response, it wouldn't be helping your child in releasing that for them. One thing that a lot of our parents do that I think is worth maybe considering with your teen would be having a deal that, although you do not encourage them to use alcohol and you don't really condone that, you are willing to pick them up if they feel like they get in a sketchy situation where maybe they went to a party and didn't realize there would be drugs and alcohol, or maybe they even took the next step and decided to have a few drinks and now they're worried about driving, or they're worried about managing their diabetes. And finally, make sure that this conversation is about their overall well-being, and try not to, connect it so heavily to type 1. So the next concerning behavior we are going to look at is eating disorders. And for this specific PowerPoint, we are going to be more focused on diabulimia. So a big concern comes about with type 1 because food and diet becomes just so central to managing one's diabetes. So whereas, dietitians, therapists say, the best way to help with eating disorders is to make food, not such a focus in someone's life. That is literally impossible with type 1. So it is something to consider. And we'll talk about some ways, that hopefully we can minimize that. People with type 1 can manipulate their insulin and withhold it to actually cause weight loss. And this can happen pretty rapidly. We know that societally, I feel like everyone is under pressure to get the ideal body type. And I think teenagers are much more susceptible and much more under pressure than really anybody else. So one way to monitor this is to make sure that you are kind of observing your teen give their shots whenever possible, maybe reviewing their, if they do wear an insulin pump, maybe reviewing and seeing where they have put those in. Another thing you could do is just keep track of their insulin if they do shots instead. Keep an eye on those and make sure that that insulin is going down. Look out for a significant, like we were saying before, unexplained increase in A1C that's really matched with a severe weight loss. That can be another sign that someone is withholding insulin. If you do suspect that your teen is withholding insulin to lose weight, I think it's smart to contact your endo team. They may have someone like me, a licensed clinical social worker, or another therapist that can be available to your teen, or they may have referral options to use if you think that it's enough of a concern that just monitoring and, having family meals isn't enough of kind of a treatment for that. What I would suggest is to make sure that no food is vilified in your home. Cake is not bad, broccoli is not good. They're all just food, and let's try to focus on making insulin just a math problem. For this many carbs, I need to give this many units. It's not bad to eat a certain amount of carbs. I'm not being good if I eat, just a few carbs. So really trying to focus on it's just food going into our body and we are just taking insulin to treat for the carbs. The final concerning behavior we are going to discuss is depression. Kids with type 1, it has been shown in studies that they are more likely than kids without type 1 to struggle with depression. I have heard numbers as high as 50% more likely. So take that with a grain of salt because, again, different studies show different numbers, but it is consistent across the board that kids with type 1 are more likely to struggle with depression in their teenage years. Some of the signs of depression, feeling sad or feeling irritable, loss of interest in things you once enjoyed, issues with appetite, issues with sleep, feeling guilty or feeling like, you're not worth enough, issues with family, social withdrawal. I'm sure most of us are familiar with some of those symptoms. If you are concerned, you can talk to your endocrinologist or your primary care physician, and oftentimes they will administer something called the Patient Health Questionnaire 9-item scale, or we know it in the biz as the PHQ-9. So that will sort of get at least a starting point, but it will identify if the child does have depression and if it's mild, moderate, or severe. If depression is left untreated, it certainly has negative effects on day-to-day functioning. People just aren't quite performing at their best. And in worst case scenarios, it can lead to self-harm or even suicide. Okay, so we're looking at how to react. Now, this can be, if you feel like one of those concerning behaviors that we discussed, diabulimia, depression, substance abuse, it could be one of those, or it could just be the general, disconnect that you might feel from your teen that just comes with them entering their teenage years and trying to gain some independence. So I would really encourage you all to try to make it a conversation rather than a confrontation. So I don't think any of us like the feeling of, you haven't been doing what you're supposed to, we need to talk. I think that's hard for anybody to hear, especially a teenager who, again, doesn't have that prefrontal cortex and that problem solving completely developed yet. So speaking of problem solving, that is the approach that I think is best. Instead of the blaming and shaming, just how can we fix it? So I do think it's often helpful for the parent to have an idea of, what kind of solution there might be to a problem, come to the team with it, and then they can modify it as needed. For example, I think you're depressed. You just seem to stay in your room all the time. You don't even love me and your dad anymore. Feels a lot different than, hey, bud, I've noticed that our family isn't spending quite as much time together, and I really want to change that. How do you feel about us starting to walk again after dinner since it's getting pretty out? Right? Do you see the difference there? How one feels like the person's automatically on the back foot. The other one sort of, hey, I had this idea. And it's kind of making it about the whole family, not just the teen. All right. And then if you feel like you're kind of hitting a wall with some of this stuff, feel free to contact your endo team. They might have some others, ideas specific to diabetes management, or as we were discussing earlier, maybe a referral for therapy or something like that. So we talked about kind of how to, talk to your teen about this. And these are some more specific approaches. As I mentioned a couple times, again, as a therapist, I might be partial, but I think therapy, it's so helpful for your teen to have someone apart from, a mom, a dad, or a family member that they might feel like will go back to mom or dad. Just someone like that to process their feelings with. Another suggestion would be modifying your expectations. And this suggestion is not popular with a lot of parents and even some doctors. It just feels not great saying it. But if we're looking at a kid that had a decent A1C, not in the danger zone really, and it goes up maybe half a point to a point, percentage in A1C, but they're also dealing with that transition of having to do their own management at school. They're out with friends more, so parents aren't there to always help count and make sure insulin is given. You know, if we're looking at just a minor change, but we're also seeing that they're really trying to do some of this on their own, I don't really see the problem in not having that, you know, perfect A1C for a short period of time as we're making those adjustments. Speaking of which, rewarding those things. You know, if your child is having trouble managing their diabetes and you feel like they're constantly missing shots or they're constantly not putting anything in their pump, I'm a big fan of, you know, if you've given injections for so many meals a day or whatever for a week, there's a small incentive attached to that. On the other side, I don't like to punish for diabetes management. I don't think anyone should ever be punished for a medical condition they have. However, we do have to link diabetes management to privileges in some ways. For example, driving a car. It's not safe to drive a car if someone is running really, really high or they're also low. So things like that automatically are attached. Same with, it's not really safe to be enjoying sports and things like that. If you're running high, you could get sick. So just being mindful of times that even though we're not punishing, there are times that our diabetes management has to be attached to privileges we have. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. If you have any questions or concerns, absolutely feel free to reach out to Lori O'Brien. She can provide you with my contact information, and have a wonderful day.
The best place on earth, can't stand it. The best place on earth, making new friends that understand what you go